আপনাদের সকলকে আবার আমন্ত্রণ ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। আমরা আজকে খুবই একটা ইম্পর্টেন্ট কেসের উপর কথা বলছি, আমি এবং আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। সেটা হইলো একটা কেয়ার হোম, ওই যে আমাদের দেশে যে রেসিডেন্সিয়াল কেয়ার হোম, যেটা ওল্ড পিপল হোম বলা হয়, ওই ওল্ড পিপলের হোম, সে যে রেসিডেন্ট যারা ছিল, বুড়া মানুষ যারা থাকতো, তাদের কাছ থেকে চিটিং করে সব পয়সা তাদের কাছ থেকে হাতাইয়ে নিয়েছিল এবং তাকে ফ্রডের জন্য কনভিকশন করে 21 বছরের জেল দেওয়া হয়েছিল। দর্শক, আমাদের যে ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি, উনি খুবই প্রমিনেন্ট এই দেশের মধ্যে, খুবই অনেক এক্সপেরিয়েন্সড, দীর্ঘ প্রায় 35 বছরের এক্সপেরিয়েন্সড কাছাকাছি ব্যারিস্টার এবং কিউসি। উনি একটা সাইট করেন crimecast.ল, সেখানে আপনার প্রত্যেক বছরের টপ র্যাঙ্কিং কেস যেগুলো, সেগুলো উনি আপডেট করে থাকেন। উনি সেখানে ভিডিও পাবলিশ করেন, সেখানে বলা হয় কেসের মধ্যে কি হয়েছে। এটাকে crimecast.ল বলা হয়, ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। এই কেসটা কিন্তু ওনার ওই সাইটের মধ্যে গেলেও যারা আপনার ইন্টারেস্টেড এই কেসটা জানার জন্য, বুঝার জন্য, তখন আপনারা দেখতে পারবেন এই কেসের মোর ডিটেইলস crimecast.ল. You will understand how hard he is working to serve the community, how much time he is devoting to develop all these new updates in the case laws on this important, very important site crimecast.ল. আপনার ওই কেয়ার হোমের যে ওনার, তাকে কনভিকশন করা হয়েছিল, was convicted of charges including conspiracy to defraud after a trial which lasted a year. তাকে আপনার চার্জ করা হয়েছিল কনস্পিরেসি টু ডিফ্রড এর জন্য, যেটা লাস্ট করেছিল অ্যাবাউট a year, তার মানে 12 মাসের জন্য। A woman 69 years who was the general manager, আপনার যে জেনারেল ম্যানেজার ছিল, was jailed for 6 years after being convicted of 3 counts of conspiracy to defraud, এবং তাকে আপনার 6 বছরের, যে জেনারেল ম্যানেজার যে ছিল ওই যে রেসিডেন্সিয়াল কেয়ার হোমে, তাকে 6 বছরের আপনার প্রিজন সেন্টেন্স দিয়েছিল। এবং জাজ বলতেছিল তাকে, she was described as David Burton's eyes and ears, এবং বলছিল কি এই ম্যানেজার সে কাজ করেছিল আপনার কেয়ার হোম বসের আইজ এবং ইয়ার, সে সবসময় সবগুলা ইনফরমেশন বাইর করত, কান সজাগ রাখতো, চোখে দেখতো কি হচ্ছে না হচ্ছে, এবং ডেভিড আপনার যে বস, যে হোমের যে বস, যে ওনার, তাকে হেল্প করেছিল একদম অ্যাক্টিভলি। David, I come back to you again. You know that this case lasted for a year, 12 months. Why it took so long? 12 months at the Liverpool Crown Court, very, very long time. 12 months, 1 year.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it took that long because it was almost the definition of a serious and complex fraud case. I mean, you can sum it up in this way, I think, Shafi. There were multiple police inquiries, there were multiple defendants, there were multiple charges, and the jury had to consider multiple transactions. Let me break that down very briefly for your viewers. David Barton was first arrested in 2014 when the family of one of his residents at the home who died and whose estate he was suing became extremely concerned about the nature of the claim that he was bringing against the estate of their late relative, and they called in the police, and that was back in 2014, as I say. The trial itself didn't start until May of 2017, and that's because the police had to undertake so many inquiries in the intervening period between the setting up of the criminal investigation and the beginning of the trial. So multiple inquiries. Multiple defendants, quite apart from David Barton, who was the main defendant. There was, as you've mentioned, the home's general manager, a lady called Rosemary Booth, who was on trial. Also the home's care manager and the home's registered manager, and in fact, David Barton's wife and 2 sons. And in fact, there would have been a yet further defendant. There would have been a solicitor on trial alongside those other defendants who was accused of having assisted David Barton in his various frauds, but that solicitor died before the trial. But there were nevertheless multiple defendants at trial. There were multiple charges which the jury had to deliver verdicts on. In the end, David Barton was convicted on a total of 10 counts, 4 counts of conspiracy to defraud, 3 of theft, 1 of fraud, 1 of false accounting, 1 of money laundering. And again, as you've mentioned, Rosemary Booth, the care home manager, convicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to defraud. So multiple counts for the jury to consider. And then finally, multiple transactions. And what do I mean by that? Well, really because of the nature of the defence that were run by the 2 main defendants, David Barton and Rosemary Booth, the jury really had to look at a really detailed background of their relationship with the residents and all of their dealings with the various residents at the home. So David Barton effectively, well, he gave evidence at trial on his own behalf, and he said that the money that he'd received from the residents was effectively gifts from them, marking their gratitude to him. He said that they'd always acted with full capacity and with the benefit of professional advice, and he said that any fees that he charged them had been legitimate, save for the occasional mistake or misunderstanding. And as far as Rosemary Booth was concerned, well, she said in her defence that while she'd been responsible for managing the domestic arrangements at the home, she hadn't had any responsibility for the financial arrangements. She said she knew very little about finance and she had very limited ability with computers. Now, that necessarily meant that the jury had to look in detail at all of their dealings with the various residents who were the alleged victims in the case. Now, you put all of those things together and you have a very complex trial, and I don't find it in the least bit surprising that it took as long as 12 months in front of the jury for that case to be tried and determined by the jury.
Okay. The court heard the residential homeowner bought several homes and a fleet of expensive cars, including 4 Ferraris and 2 Rolls Royces. এবং কোর্ট শুনছে কি যে এই বস যে রেসিডেন্সিয়াল কেয়ার হোম ওনার, সে আপনার অনেকগুলো ঘর, several homes এবং and fleet of expensive cars, অনেকগুলো expensive cars including Ferraris এবং Rolls Royces. Sentencing judge, he said he was despicably greedy man. He said, the judge said he was despicably greedy man. David, what do you have to say on this one?
Well, I have to say, Shafiul, it's difficult to disagree with that description of David Barton. I mean, if you just look at the way in which the case first came to light, came to the attention of the police, I mentioned in answer to your previous question that it was a family of one of the residents at the home who contacted the police after she died. The reason that they contacted the police was that after that resident died, David Barton, through his company and in his own name, sued her estate for £10 million. He was claiming that she owed, or her estate owed him, approximately £10 million in relation to her stay, her residence at the home. And that was the trigger, if you like, for the police investigation. So, yes, that description, despicably greedy, seems apt when you just look at the very beginning of the investigation. And then you look at what came out after the police investigated it. As you say, he'd obtained a number of properties. He'd accumulated a portfolio of 23 different properties in the Southport area, all owned either by himself or his wife, or by his company. You've mentioned that he had a fleet of cars. Again, you're right. Luxury cars, 4 Ferraris, 3 Rolls Royces, 2 high-value Mercedes, other vehicles besides. I've mentioned the £10 million claim, which led to the case coming to light. And the other, I suppose, relevant factor in terms of that description of David Barton as having been despicably greedy is that the police investigations established that during the period that they were looking at, he had obtained more than £4.1 million from residents at the home. So you put all those things together, the £4.1 million, the £10 million claim, the fleet of luxury cars and the 23 properties in the Southport area. And yes, I think that description of him as despicably greedy sounds about right.
Yes. দর্শক, ডিসপিকেবলি গ্রেডি ম্যান মানে আমাদের বাংলায় যেটা বলে ঘৃণ্য, একদম লোভী, একদম ঘৃণ্যতম লোভী। ডিসপিকেবলি গ্রেডি মানে ঘৃণার মতো একদম লোভী, সে তাকে ঘৃণা করার মতো লোভ তার ছিল। I am quite sure the person you care for most is yourself. জাজ বলছে কি যে আমি শিওর তুমি শুধু তোমার জন্যই নিজের মানে নিজেকেই তুমি কেয়ার করো। Not even your family, তুমি তোমার ফ্যামিলির জন্য তুমি কেয়ার করো না। With an insatiable appetite for fancy cars and building your property empire. এবং জাজ বলছে কি তোমার insatiable appetite মানে এটারে বাংলায় যেটা আমি বলবো মানে তোমার অতৃপ্ত ক্ষুধা, তোমার এই ক্ষুধা তোমার মিটবে না, অতৃপ্ত ক্ষুধা, insatiable appetite এটাকে বলা হয় যে তোমার ক্ষুধার তৃপ্ততা আর মানে শেষ হবে না। For fancy cars, building property empire, এগুলা বিল্ড করার জন্য তোমার অতৃপ্ত ক্ষুধা। He added, I am struggling to remember anyone as dishonest as him. এবং জাজ সাহেব বলছেন কি আমি স্ট্রাগল করতেছি স্মরণ করতে তার মতো এত অসৎ মানুষ, as dishonest as him, as morally bankrupt as him, যে তার মতো এত অসৎ এবং নৈতিকভাবে এত ব্যাংক্রাফট আমি এটা রিমেম্বার করতে পারতেছি না এরকম অন্য কেউকে। What is your opinion on this judge's remark, David, the morally bankrupt as him?
Strong language from a judge, but I don't find it terribly surprising given the evidence that the judge had heard. It was reflected in the sentence which he passed. The judge at the end of the trial, when David Barton was convicted by the jury, passed a sentence of 21 years imprisonment. That is almost unheard of, almost unprecedented in the English criminal law for a fraud sentence. It's right to say that it was reduced slightly by the Court of Appeal. They reduced it to a sentence of 17 years imprisonment, but you know, those sentences really reflect pretty much what the view that the judge took about the moral bankruptcy of this man. The only thing I would say is, and I don't want in any way to lessen the force of what the judge said, or to suggest that it was anything other than despicable what had happened, but just a slight note of caution. One of the most striking features of the case, and the element of it which made it legally interesting, it's a very important case in the law, actually, for reasons I probably don't need to mention now. But one of the striking features was that nobody suggested that any of these victims had been, for example, abused, physically abused in any way, in order to get them to make these gifts, or to make him the executor of a will, or to make him the beneficiary of a will, or to give him a power of attorney. The evidence was quite clear that the victims, the vulnerable old people in the home, who entered into the various transactions that they did with David Barton had mental capacity to do so. They knew what they were doing, albeit that they were vulnerable and they were isolated from other advice when they did so. But they believed that they knew what they were doing. They wanted to enter into these transactions, far from being physically abused by David Barton. The evidence tended to show that before they moved to Barton Park, many of them had been living in rather unsatisfactory conditions, and that when they moved to Barton Park, they were actually physically well looked after and cared for, and they were very happy with their new surroundings, and they felt that they were well looked after. They were delighted to be there, and actually they were grateful to David Barton for taking them in. So it's a very odd contrast, if you like, between the attitude of some of these old people who ended up paying very large amounts of money to David Barton, and the fact that they were undoubtedly victims, as the jury found and as the judge confirmed. But it wasn't a straightforward case where they were compelled against their will to enter into transactions, for example. It was a very different sort of a case from that. That made it legally interesting in a way which I probably don't need to go into for the moment, but it was a striking factual feature of the case. So that's the only sort of note of caution I would sound about the way in which the judge described David Barton's moral bankruptcy and so on.
Yeah, okay. Dashok, nursing home was described as an opulent state. এই নার্সিং হোমটা একটা সমৃদ্ধশালী সম্পত্তি ছিল। সমৃদ্ধ আমাদের দেশ যেটা আমরা বাংলায় বলি, opulent state, এটা একটা সমৃদ্ধ সম্পদ ছিল একেবারে। ওকে, described as, you know, his eyes and ears in the care home. The manager helped turn residents against their families, the court heard. এবং কোর্ট শুনছে কি যে ম্যানেজার, যে জেনারেল ম্যানেজার, ওই মহিলা, যে মহিলাকেও আপনার 6 বছরের প্রিজন সেন্টেন্স দিয়েছিল, সে তার ওই বুড়া লোকজনদেরকে তাদের পরিবারের এগেইনস্টে টার্ন আউট ডাউন করছিল, তাদের এগেইনস্টে তাদেরকে আইসোলেট করেছিল এবং তাদেরকে বিচ্ছিন্ন করছিল সব আত্মীয় স্বজনের কাছ থেকে। এবং এইগুলার জন্য জাজ বলছে কি সে ওই যে বসের আইজ অ্যান্ড ইয়ার্স হিসাবে কাজ করছে, সে তার চোখ কান খোলা রাখতো এই অ্যাক্টিভিটিস গুলো করার জন্য। The judge described her as an enthusiastic conspirator in the fraud. জাজ ডেসক্রাইব করেছিল ওই মহিলা যে জেনারেল ম্যানেজার ছিল তাকে একজন enthusiastic conspirator in the fraud. David, just what's your opinion on this, the enthusiastic conspirator?
Well, it's a very pithy way of describing the judge's view about Rosemary Booth. I mean, again, fully justified in describing her in that way. The evidence which the jury heard showed that she had abused her trusted position as the general manager at Barton Park, and as I'm trying to think of the right word, I suppose the confidant of many of the residents there. They trusted her, and she undoubtedly abused and exploited the trust which she built up with residents at Barton Park. And as you've said, it was the prosecution who described her as David Barton's eyes and ears in the home. She was there, obviously, frequently and regularly as the care home manager, and she was in a position to feed information back to him, and that's what was meant by acting as his eyes and ears. As I've mentioned, she claimed that her role was rather more limited than the prosecution had alleged, that she accepted that she'd been responsible for managing all of the domestic arrangements at Barton Park, but as I've previously mentioned, she claimed that she'd had no responsibility at all for any of the financial affairs of the home or the financial arrangements there. She had little knowledge or familiarity with finance, and she had very limited ability with computers. And I think it must follow from the jury's verdict that they, in effect, rejected what she was saying about those matters, because they found her guilty on 3 counts of conspiracy to defraud. She was very much the second defendant in the sort of hierarchy in the list of defendants before the jury, as was reflected in the sentence of 6 years which the judge imposed on her.
Yeah, 6 years. Yeah, she got 6 years. Yeah, I think we are out of time in this segment. We will talk more on this case, David, on different other issues, the judge's remarks and all this in the next segment. And then we will come to that point in the next segment. দর্শক, আমরা একটা শর্ট ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম এবং আমার সাথে আছেন আমার কলিগ ডেভিড ওয়ালব্যাংক কিউসি। সবাই আমাদের সাথেই থাকুন।